Hi, my name is Vincent Covello, Dr. Vincent Covello, and in this segment, in this module, I'll be talking about dealing with the media, communicating effectively with the media. And I'll be focusing in this presentation, this module, on communicating with the traditional media as opposed to social media. Traditional media usually includes radio, television, newspapers, as opposed to social media, things such as Twitter or Facebook, etc. There are major difference between the two. I'll just mention that now because there is another module dealing with social media, and I encourage you to take a look at that. Probably the main difference between traditional media and social media is the opportunity in social media with two-way communication. Traditional communication with the media is one-way communication. Obviously, there are opportunities in some traditional media for comment or discussion, but largely it's a one-way form of communication, as opposed to two-way communication, where you can have a dialogue, where you can address rumors and disinformation. You can actually look at the issue more from a discussion perspective through social media than you would through traditional media. With that in mind, let me share with you what we know and what is best practice as it relates to traditional media. I'll begin with a Chinese character for the word crisis. Particularly dealing with the media in a crisis situation is probably the most challenging and difficult. And I always found fascinating that the Chinese have two characters for the word crisis. The first is the word danger, and the second is the word opportunity, which basically is communicating that, yes, a crisis poses a threat to reputation, to health, to safety, but also it's an opportunity. It's an opportunity, for example, to share information that addresses the questions that people have, such as who, what, where, when, why, how. Those are considered to be the 6 basic questions that traditional media will ask you related to a crisis situation. You can make the situation a lot worse by how you respond to those 6 questions: who, what, where, when, why, how, and also you can make the situation much better. In fact, in many cases, you can actually save lives and create the opportunity for sharing useful information. With that in mind, there's several different aspects of dealing with the media. It begins with, as with all communication, which is understanding your stakeholder. Who is it that I'm addressing? Each traditional media will have their own set of stakeholders. Fox News, for example, will have a particular set of stakeholders that tune into Fox News, and others will go, for example, to CBS or even CNN. So the first is understand the media itself, but also understand something about the journalist and how they approach issues. There's been quite a bit of research over the years about journalists and their backgrounds. For example, many journalists begin their careers in fields such as English literature or political science or even the social sciences. But generally, you find that many journalists, except for those who are specialists, stay away from the more technical fields, such as statistics or epidemiology or toxicology. This has implication for communication because we often start at a very fundamental level when we talk to journalists about an issue, except again with specialist journalists. And understanding that many journalists do not have a technical background automatically means we have to perhaps change the way we communicate. We have to be, for example, much more sensitive to a template called AGL-4. Take the average grade level of the audience and subtract 4. That applies to all individuals, but you would start, for example, your conversation with a journalist making very few assumptions about what they know about the issue itself, unless you have indications that they're a specialist. For example, you want to be very careful in using acronyms, EPA, FDA, even CDC, you have to be careful of that they don't understand what those acronyms mean when referring to different agencies. Or if you're referring to, let's say, environmental cleanup, you want to be very careful about using words like SARA, RCRA, NEPA. Why? Because those are names of laws, but nonetheless, the journalists would not necessarily be familiar with those laws, let alone technical language. So talking about monoclonal antibodies or DNA adducts certainly would be excluded from the conversation, unless you're willing to give a very simple definition of the terms themselves. Another aspect of the media, too, that I would mention is that we sometimes think of the media as a public service as opposed to what they are, which is a business. They do serve a public service. They do function as watchdogs. They do function as a way by which to inform people about who, what, where, when, why, and how. But again, they sell news. In the same way that you sell a product, consumer product, they also sell news. And that's important also for our discussion, because when you sell news, the question is what sells. And and certainly scandal cell, crisis cells, anything that takes large number of lives in a short period of time would sell. And being sensitive to those aspects are important because, as I mentioned later, the media often will organize stories around what the narrative that sells, which is called the villain, the victim, and the hero. Who's the villain in the story that's imposing a threat upon people? Who's the victim of the threat, and who's the hero that comes to the rescue? Often the media will play that role of co-hero because they bring to the attention things that people maybe did not know about before, such as, let's say, Ebola or Zika or H1N1. Most people learn about these issues first through the media and how they report the issues. The media environment is very intense, especially traditional media. For example, they work under extreme deadlines. Many general reporters, general assignment reporters, will get sometimes 2, 3, 4 stories a day, and they have to file a report by the end of the day about something they may not know very much about. But it's critical to meet their deadlines. Why? Because if you miss the deadline, you effectively create an empty hole in their story. And so it's critical. In fact, that's one of the first questions you should ask a journalist if they call, which is, what is your deadline? And make sure you get information that fills that gap within that deadline period. They also have to become instant experts, which is an extraordinary skill, that they're able to learn quickly about an issue, learn what types of questions to ask, to filter and interpret the information. And again, anything we can do to help them to better understand the issue so that they become effectively an instant expert, except with those people who do specialized reporting, would be helpful. And finally, the last point I'd like to make is that the media environment has always been competitive. You're competing with other newspapers, you're competing with television, you can be with radio. But especially in the world of social media, you're competing with lots of other sources of information that don't often have to do the same type of fact-checking, such as a Wikipedia piece or a blog. And this has made the environment for the media much more competitive than in the past. The result is that the issue of the villain, victim, hero becomes even more important. Do they create stories that are interesting, likely to engage people and to buy newspapers or tune into TV? In terms of meeting their needs, our job is to communicate the truth, but tell it as best we can under the circumstances with the constraints in mind. And if you cannot provide information to the media, I would strongly suggest that you fill the gap, that you don't create a vacuum. For example, if you don't know the answer to a question, you would explain why you don't know the answer to the question. One of the templates I often use when dealing with the media or coaching people on the media is called the KDK template. What we know about the issue, what we don't know about the issue, and what we're doing to fill the gap. And then you can bridge to other pieces of useful information. Also, if you can't meet the deadline immediately, let them know when you can get back to them as soon as possible and see if you can negotiate that issue with the media. One of the most important things with dealing with the media is that they work in an environment that is often, except for the lengthy pieces, very brief and succinct. The KISS principle comes into play. Initially start off simple and short, not simple stupid, but simple and short. Keep your answers very succinct, and it's more likely that information will be transmitted through the media. In fact, the traditional soundbite is often as little as 27 words, 9 seconds, 3 messages. That when they take what you say about an issue, they will often cut it or truncate it to less than 27 words on average, 9 seconds on average, or 3 messages, whichever comes first. And that puts a premium on our being succinct in how we express ourselves to the media. And finally, you want to make sure that you're very calm and patient with the media. Again, they might be asking questions that you're surprised about because of their lack of technical knowledge. Again, the important thing here is to make sure that you have the ability to communicate simply and then make it more complex, understanding, for example, how much the person who's interviewing you understands about the issue. Key to any effective communication is preparation. There's a key template in the literature called anticipation, preparation, and practice, that we anticipate the questions, we anticipate the stakeholder, we anticipate the issue itself. And that applies to the traditional media as to any other form of risk or crisis communication, that we try to anticipate the questions and concerns before they're addressed to us. Luckily, there's been a great deal of information produced about how to anticipate questions that journalists For example, one document I produced was called the 77 Most Frequently Asked Questions by Journalists in a Disaster. It was based on analysis we did of over 2,000 disasters. And what are the questions that journalists typically ask? This is a resource material that will be available in the Drexel file. I strongly encourage you to take a look at that if you have a crisis situation or an emergency situation. They represent approximately 95% of the questions that journalists ask at a general level whenever there's a crisis or disaster. Again, it was based on nearly 2,000 cases of disaster where we extracted from that database the 77 most frequently asked questions, which actually represent close to 95% of the questions that journalists ask at a general level. Moving on, when you're responding to the questions, if you've anticipated the question, you should prepare a message. In fact, when dealing with traditional media, you typically have a takeaway message before you even begin the interview, before the questions are asked. You're asking yourself, what is most important for people to know? What is most important thing that people want to know? So two things. Number one, what do you want people to know? And number two is what do they want to know about the issue? And you would develop your key messages based on that understanding of what you want them to know and what they do want to know about the issue. And then you want to find opportunities throughout the communication to bridge back to those takeaway key messages. That shifts the emphasis from what's called a question-driven interview, media interview, to an answer-driven interview, where you already know what key messages you want to share and use the opportunity of the media interview to get back to. You also might want to summarize at the very end. For example, what is it that we would like most people? You can use the opportunity at the end of the interview and saying, since we've had a chance to talk about this issue, there are several points I would like to just re-emphasize again at the end. This again hammers home the key messages that you prepared in advance. If you don't get the opportunity in a particular question, you can always say, let me add, or what's important also for people to know, and use that as the opportunity to get back to your agenda as opposed to necessarily what the reporter might have in mind. There's a number of traps and pitfalls in communication. Probably the one that gets most attention is something called off the record. As a general principle, consider yourself never to be off the record. Anything you say can become a headline, can become a media story. Journalists often will, for example, indicate that, can you give me some background or off the record? They may quite honestly intend to keep it off the record. But think about this, that in the same way that a law enforcement officer, if they see a crime being committed, they have to report. The reporter may be in the same situation. If they hear something off the record they believe that the public needs to know in their watchdog function, then they might, for example, have to violate that promise to you. The safest thing to do is simply be on the record all the time, but consider anything that you say to be quotable, especially in today's world of social media where information can quickly move on. Since you are on the record, this applies, strangely enough, even before the interview. For example, if the reporter is chatting with you about the issue before the interview, can still consider yourself to be on the record. Anything you say can be quoted later in a story. Same thing with after the interview itself. Even after the reporter leaves, you want to be very careful, for example, that if they had a taping device, that it's not still there. Why? Because, again, anything that you say can and perhaps may be used in not a court of law, but in the court of public opinion in terms of the traditional media reporting of the issue. Anything you say offhand, for example, can become a quote. Certainly anything flippant or humorous can become a career destroyer. Why? There's numerous instances where that's happened in the past. And when you provide information, you always want to make sure that you give the opportunity to the reporter to have further information provided. A couple of hints. Another trap and pitfall, no comment. Research now indicates that as much as 85% of people believe that no comment in response to a question indicates guilt or hiding something important. And so therefore it's important to basically focus on what you feel needs to be known. Again, if you have no comment on the issue, that doesn't mean you can't say what I do know about the issue is, what I don't know about the issue, why you don't know it, and what you're doing to get that information. Let me just focus for a second on the issue of target. Your first point, there's a principle in communication called primacy recency. What you say first and last is most important, and therefore you want to make sure that you lead with the most important message. You want to make sure that your story is is linear, that it follows a linear pattern, and then lead to the conclusion. It's a variation on something you may have heard back in high school, which is tell me more, tell me again. Especially in the opportunity with a sit-down interview, tell the reporter in advance what's most important to know. Typically no more than 3 messages. Expand upon those messages and then complete, for example, the presentation with a repetition of those key messages. If you don't do this, unfortunately, if you're not on the mark, if you tend to get obscure or confused in the process, you often find that the story will be dropped entirely, which means your side of the story is not being told. It's another reason for avoiding no comment. You want your story, your messages to be heard, and if they're not being heard, no one else necessarily will be sharing those messages. There's a number of templates that are very useful for, I've discussed these in other modules, the templates that come from both the neuroscience and behavioral science. This is a short list of the templates that you should be master of before you share information to the media. Unfortunately, mastery is often a skill, according to Malcolm Gladwell, can take as many as 10,000 hours of practice before you can master a skill such as media communication skills. The list starts off with the rule of 3, which says that effectively we should have 3 key messages that we repeat 3 times in our media interview, and at least 3 supporting facts for each of the key messages we share. The notion of 3 supporting facts is critical, that we have depth. We're not just simply sound bites, but we actually can elaborate, defend, provide more information related to any of our key messages. And the last one there is the AGL-4, that we want to keep the message very short and simple, and then be prepared to elaborate as necessary. Other principles there include the 2793, that we organize our 3 messages ideally in less than 27 words, 9 seconds of material. We put the most important messages first and last. That's called primacy, recency. A key message in communication is often the message of empathy and caring. People want to know that you care before they care what you know, and therefore you might start off with a message of compassion, empathy, listening, followed by a message of conviction related to what you know, and finish up with a message of optimism and hope that's facts-based. If you have a negative message to share, such as bad news, you want to balance that with 3 positives. And the IDK template starts off with I don't know, although I'm strongly recommending that you might use as an alternative to IDK something called KDK, which is what I know, what I don't know, and then what you're doing to fill the gap. In today's world of social media, you often will find that if you start off with I don't know, that may become the soundbite that is transmitted through social media, and other people will fill the gap that you have now, or the vacuum you've created. Key again is choosing the right spokesperson. The right spokesperson requires a number of skills. First skill is the recognition of the need to anticipate the questions in advance, prepare the messages, and then practice. Again, the APP model starts off with anticipating the issue that's likely to give rise to media interest. Anticipating the stakeholders, who's most interested or affected or influential on the issue, and then anticipating the questions and concerns, preparing the messages, and then preparing the messengers. Key, for example, in the messenger is not just the messages, but also even nonverbal communication, as it applies particularly to the media such as television or the radio. Why? Because people will evaluate you not simply on what you say, but also what you look like and what you sound like when you say it. And therefore, considering the nonverbal communication becomes a critical part of that process as well. I believe there's a whole segment dealing with nonverbal communication and what we need to be attentive in nonverbal communication, such as good eye contact, such as good use of hands, posture, dress and appearance. All these play a critical role in how effective you are, particularly when there's visual information or vocal information available to the media. Before the interview, you actually do have rights. In the same way you have rights as a suspect in a criminal case, you have rights, for example, as it relates to the media. For example, you have a right to ask what the story will be about. There's something tricky here, which is that if you ask for specific questions, often you will find that the policy of most media organizations is not to give you the specific questions, but they are willing to tell you what the topic is. And so one of the first questions you might ask a journalist who call you on the phone or ask for an interview is, what's the topic? Make sure it's appropriate for your expertise. If it's not, you simply would say the most appropriate person to talk about that is someone else. My expertise is this. Based on that topic, then you want to determine what are your key messages. You want to have the 3 points you want to make. You would try to organize those 3 points into sound bites, 2793 sound bites. You would prepare for potential follow-up questions that must follow from any sound bite. You also want to take into account how you respond to the toughest questions. For example, challenging questions. Can you guarantee something? Do you believe that you would personally, for example, be willing to drink the water, or would you be personally willing, for example, to expose yourself to this risk? Think through those various pitfall and trap and challenging questions. Most of them relate to trust and credibility, such as why should we believe you? Why should we trust you? Be prepared for those questions as well as the specific questions that will come up during the interview itself. And then always think about the 5 W's and the 1 H. Who, what, where, when, why, and how. Journalists learn in journalism school that these are the first questions they need to have addressed in a media interview. Since they're the first questions, we want to make sure we also have those as part of our first responses. Don'ts, there's unfortunately a very, very long list of don'ts. I mentioned already some. For example, don't go off the record. Don't, for example, challenge a reporter or get involved in an argument. There's some more subtle types of things, such as don't speculate. Talk about facts. If they ask you, for example, is it possible that, focus on, for example, what you know as opposed to what you don't know. You want to be careful about making promises that you can't keep. I mentioned before the importance of keeping it short and simple, so we avoid technical words and jargon. Often our tendency is to want to blame others, point fingers at others. Unfortunately, that very seldomly works effectively dealing with the media. We don't want to use humor. Why? Because automatically it communicates the message that we're not taking the issues seriously. We don't want to repeat strong negative allegations, especially when they're not true. So just someone would say to you, that's a lie, as opposed to saying, that's not a lie. Or if someone says that's criminal, instead of saying that's not criminal, and I'm not a crook, talk about what you are as opposed to what you're not, especially, again, if the allegation is untrue. A subtlety on that, strong negatives tend to go into the part of the brain, the amygdala, as a visual image. So when Richard Nixon said, I'm not a crook, you still think of Nixon as a crook. The association with the visual. Unfortunately, that part of the brain often doesn't carry the grammar, the not part. So therefore, do not repeat strong negative allegations. Do not, for example, argue, become defensive in the process. Be extremely helpful to the reporter. And finally, as I mentioned before, we're never off the record. After the interview, you can ask the reporter, for example, when the story will run. You want to thank the reporter for the opportunity to make the points that you wanted to make, and also make yourself available to the reporter if they need some follow-up information in order to clarify anything that came up in the interview itself. You want to make sure that you know what your agenda is. Make sure you're delivering those messages. And again, I'm repeating myself, but I think it's worth repeating that you want to bridge back continually to those messages, because this is your opportunity to have your story told. If you're not telling the story, who else is going to tell the story for you? You are the expert in the issue. To be effective, you want to make sure that what you share certainly is accurate. You want to make sure that if you're sharing information that is clear and brief, you want to back up the information. Trust and credibility comes into play. What other credible sources are you citing that would verify or validate the information you're sharing? You want to make sure that you're providing quotable quotes. Anything that would be easily quotable becomes automatically a soundbite for the purposes of communication. And therefore, we also want to use the opportunity of creating visual images, mental images. For example, storytelling or short storytelling becomes an effective technique that distinguishes the average media spokesperson from the extraordinary media spokesperson. Here are some of the questions that you can anticipate. This is a short list. Again, I mentioned before that there's a much longer list for many different issues. This is a short list for controversial questions that are likely to come up. It starts off with some general questions such as what happened, who happened, but then they can easily sort of get involved in much more complicated questions in the process. Bridging. Bridging is one of the most difficult but also most effective skills that you can offer to the journalist. You want to respond to the questions. Many, for example, politicians don't respond to the questions. They immediately bridge to what they want to say. I would argue that that's evasive, can automatically make you look like you're not being responsive to the questions. And therefore, you should have a full repertoire of bridging statements you can use in order to share information. For example, after responding to a question, you can say, and most important to know, or perhaps I would return back to, or let me repeat by saying this, or here are the steps we've taken in order to achieve these goals. It's your opportunity to get back to your key messages, recognizing again that we want to turn it from an interview or a question-driven interview to a message-driven interview or answer-driven interview. Finally, there are resources available. I strongly recommend that you take a look at the resources available on the Drexel website. For example, we're talking about hundreds of sound bites that you can use that are in the Twitter format. Again, a great deal of information that I would strongly recommend that you use as a way by which to supplement this short introduction to being effective with the media. Thank you.